Hello, friends of the paranormal. This is your co-host, Stu, and I'm here with the paranormalist, Patty Wilson. Patty, how are you this fine day?
I'm doing pretty good. It is Father's Day when this is being recorded, so happy Father's Day to you, Stu, and happy belated Father's Day to the fathers out there that are listening later on.
Thank you. We would like to say that if you haven't subscribed already, please consider subscribing, and we've noticed even more subscribers this past week, so we thank you for those. If you are new subscribers, we applaud you. Thank you for finding us. Please consider clicking the thumbs up on whatever platform you are. In the description below, you'll find everything Paranormalist Podcast related, Facebook groups, and all the various and sundry things. And I wanted to point out during our initial conversation with Patty, we had a little bit of lag maybe in the video and audio. So if you see that, I will try to do what I can when I edit. But I can't work magic if the data is missing. So we'll try to stretch that out and make it look as good as we can. So with that, what is our topic today?
So these are real life monsters of the Appalachian Mountains. I decided for the last episode in our little journey into the Appalachian Mountains to do the monsters that might have some real life counterparts.
Oh, neat. Yeah.
So let's just begin. So before there was ever the first European ever stepped on the Appalachian Mountains, if the Appalachian Mountains were filled with Native American people who had distinct cultures and distinct folklore. Now, the interesting thing to me, because I collect a lot of folklore and history, is that they had very similar creatures, and these creatures were really distinctive. So we're going to talk a little bit about that. So before the Europeans, whether they were Scottish, Irish, British, German, Dutch, Spanish, whatever they were, ended up on the Appalachian Mountains, the natives had chronicled and documented a lot of these stories. Now, I want to say that there's two things you should know going into this. First, because there was no written language for the Native American people, they were very cautious about making sure their stories stayed accurate because they had to be passed down generation to generation verbally. And the other thing you should know is that there is, however, bleed through. So perhaps an Ojibwe marries into a Cherokee family and might bring some of the folklore along and might change some of the terminology because they recognize the being, but it just had a different name in their culture.
Okay.
And so for that reason, you might find something that has 3 or 4 names. It's not that there really are 3 or 4 names. It's just different nations of people translated them slightly differently. And we're not going to get into too much of that because frankly, I'm not phenomenal at speaking any Native American language. So I'm not going to do a whole lot of it. I will tell you a few of the names, however, because they're pretty interesting and they might have something to do with it. The first one that I wanted to talk about was a really interesting creature that is part human and part something else. So it was the Sac-de-Wamuch, and it is a malignant sorcerer. So there were black magicians and the white magicians or healers in most Native American cultures, and the black ones, the ones who perpetuated evil and control and what have you during their life, when they died, they would end up either going elsewhere, or if they stayed here for some reason, this is when it gets interesting. So the term for them, when you translate it, is a ghost witch. And the stories are fascinating. So basically, these beings would appear in the daytime as though they were dead, and they might be laid out in make arrangements with somebody in their family to have them laid out in a cave or someplace like this. And they become shapeshifters, prowlers of the night, hunting for humans to curse or to consume. And almost every single culture had stories like this. So we can most easily relate them to a vampire, to be honest, or a zombie or a wrath, something like that. These beings were bent on cannibalizing the living humans or cursing them and watching them slowly suffer. They are really interested in pain and what have you. So as I said, they become animated after it is dark. The only way to kill these beings would be to burn them and scatter the ashes to the four winds. So the only way you could stop one of these beings when they start was by literally finding their lair. Again, very vampiric. Finding their lair in the daylight when they weren't able to transmutate, and setting them on fire, and then gathering those ashes and scattering them so that they couldn't put themselves back together. And I thought it was really interesting because ostensibly, I mean, we're beginning to be questioning this more and more, but ostensibly, the European and the Eastern European cultures where these vampires came from had no impact at that point of first white contact with the natives. And yet the natives long had a story of their own vampire-like creature. And, you know, is this real or is it not? Well, it's interesting to me that it was talked about in almost every single Native American nation along the Appalachians. So the Appalachians run all the way from Quebec, Canada, all the way down through Georgia. And as I keep saying, Native American nation, you should know that they are distinctive nations of people. So they're not all like one community. They have their own separate rituals and rites and customs and languages and what have you. And so there's some that are like interlocking, like the Iroquois Confederacy. You'll see that the Algonquin and a lot of the different nations in the Seven Nations shared some language because they negotiated and came together for peace and war over the course of time. So they had a little commonality, but they had distinctly separate cultures with distinctly separate ways of running their communities and everything else. So that's why I say nations, because there are nations, and there are also still nations to this day inside of this nation. That's why the reservations, particularly in the West, we're familiar with, have their own police forces and stuff, because they are literally a sovereign nation inside of a nation. So when you hear me talk about that, that's what I'm talking about. And wanted to start with the next one. I thought this is the first one that actually has some real life application. This is the Dwayyo. Dwayyo is reported in Maryland, Virginia, West Virginia, but mostly Maryland. And it's this really interesting creature. We would call it a dog man today. So it's about 7 to 9 foot tall, hairy cryptid with what they called a wolf face. We would recognize it as a dog face. And the word Dwayyo comes from the German words for fast ghost. So it's obviously a creature that moves very quickly. And I had some really interesting, I went back into some folklore for this one, and I came across some really interesting stuff that I wanted to share with everybody about this particular creature. And so there are still sightings of this particular creature even today. Okay. And today, by I mean modern times, within the 21st century. So in 1950s, there were a group of hikers in one of the local, what we call national parks today, and they saw a being that they described as this dog man-like creature. They didn't have a word for it. So they would either have called it a werewolf or whatever. But immediately after this thing's seen, the hikers in the 50s reported a wolf-like creature on 2 legs in the forest of Frederick County. So that's Frederick County, Maryland, literally about 40, 50 miles from where I live. This is the very first modern sighting of this beast that the Native Americans talked about. There are lots of encounters. I've gotten 2 books recently of the folklore and the history of this region, in which early settlers, late 16, early 1700s, wrote of hearing or seeing these beings. And one talked about them circling their cabin and what they sounded like. So the interesting thing about these beings that I thought very early on is all the encounters consistently talk about a couple things. First of all, they're bipedal dog-like things, seemingly 7 to 9 feet tall, but they also have a distinctive sound. So they start out sounding like a baby crying, and then they raise in pitch until they sound like a woman screaming. What an unnerving thing to hear.
Yep.
So, yeah, I mean, can you
Yeah.
imagine, like, it's the middle of the night and you're living in a log cabin in the middle of the woods and there's nobody around, and you start to hear this thing that sounds like a baby, and you're like, where's that baby sound coming from? Is there somebody, did somebody abandon a baby out there? And just, because it's crying and crying and crying, and just as you're ready to open the door and go out and look with the lantern, this thing becomes a woman screaming as if she's in pain. What a terrifying thing to hear. So that was the first one, the 1950s. Now in the early 1960s, we come across the second sighting. This was a gentleman by the name of John Becker, and he described what he called a 6-foot tall, black furred bipedal creature in his backyard. His dog was barking, and so he opened his door and stepped outside to see what was out there, and came face to face with this thing, if you can believe that. And it lunged at him, and he wrestled with it, got back through the door, and slammed the door shut.
No kidding.
And this is, by the way, it is not too far away from Gambrel State Park, which is not too far from where the original sighting of the 1950s was, and not too far away from where the traditional sightings going all the way back to the late 1600s were. So this is the same area. He called the police and told them what had happened. He was really rattled. People didn't believe him. They were like, oh, he must have made it up or something like this. But he was insistent that it was a real creature. So they look around a little bit and nothing. They find nothing. So the police just kind of write it off as, it is what it is. So this would be in November of 1965 that John Becker has his first encounter. And he calls the Maryland State Police. Now, he says to the police on the report that his name is John Becker, that he lives on Fern Rock Road, which is a narrow dirt road near an entrance to the state park. And he says that he's in Frederick County. However, nobody can find this road. It doesn't seem to exist. And he doesn't sound to the officer taking the call like he was pranking them. Like there was no laughter or anything. But eventually they kind of come down to the idea that he must have been pranking them because they can't find it. However, things get really interesting because a couple days later, another man from the Frederick area was out hunting in an area called Middletown. And he calls the police telling them that he and his dogs were out chasing, whatever he was hunting that day. And all of a sudden, out of nowhere, the dogs began to act strangely and veered away from the wildlife he was after. He saw this large black thing coming at them. And he said at first he thought it was a big dog or maybe a small bear. And then it stood up, and he said, however, after reading the newspaper article, I'm not sure that what I saw wasn't a whale. So he said it trotted like a horse. And he said, I don't know what it was, and I'm looking for it. I've been looking for it since this past weekend when he had the first encounter. So he talks about it. And Mr. May, one of the men who owned the newspaper in town, he was very concerned about what was going on. So he begins to start talking about this thing in the newspaper, and I'm sure it was good because it sold papers. However, this is the interesting part. He tells everybody in the newspaper article he's a skeptic, he doesn't have any idea what's going on, but that he talked to the police officers who investigated, and that sounded like the end of it until a few weeks later when a police officer that knew Mr. May, who was the guy who owned the paper, reached out and told Mr. May, hey, we have a really weird phone call. Somebody just called us and said that they had the Dueo, or at least a Dueo, held captive in their basement, and they've had it there for almost a year. However, and they said that he told them, come on out. I want you to get rid of it. Whatever it is, it's a terrible beast. I trapped it down there, and I didn't have I didn't know what to do with it. So I fed it, and I honestly don't know what to do. And now I know what it is, and come get it. So here's what happens. If this guy gives his name, his address, and all of it, and the police go to the house, and they find that this guy's like, sure, it's down there. I was down there 2 days ago, 3 days ago. And he goes downstairs. Now, I have to say that I have to imagine that either the guy was mentally ill, or this is an insane story that may be true. He goes down there, and the basement's all kind of torn up, and there's scratches and stuff all through it, but the Dueo is gone. So fast forward to Elderton, Maryland, a few days after this, and this woman reports that she had heard something in the near her house, again on the Catatichen Mountain, which is where that park is at. And she said it cried like a baby, then it screamed like a woman. We've heard it off and on for months. I didn't know what it was, and my husband's gone out to try to look for it or find footprints from it, but we have found nothing. I just know that whatever it was out there for quite a while. So she tells this story, and the neighbors start looking. And then in Middletown, Maryland, there's another call reported, and the guy says that the Dueo had come across his property. It looked like a large dog, but it was on all fours and then stood up on 2 legs, was extremely tall, and then took off running on 2 legs. So whenever they drew the picture of it, they had a photographer or an artist draw a photograph of it for the newspaper, and it looks kind of like an Irish wolfhound up on 2 legs. So people started saying, well, it was just a big dog and you misunderstood, and the rest of it was just imagination. However, there were people in town that claimed that they had seen it or heard it, or that they believed the stories. And so almost 100 people signed up for a Dueo hunt. They were going to go out and try to flush this thing out. I know, it's a weird story. So a boy from Frederick, Maryland, said that he said, I think this is just an imaginary thing. He comes along and sees this creature, and he had actually expressed that it was something the grown-ups were using to scare kids. He's like 12 years old, so that they wouldn't go out in the woods. However, this kid subsequently has an experience and is really freaked out, and his family calls the police, and the police come and get these reports. So it's like a mass of sightings in this little area. This goes through late spring, so from November of 65 through May of 66, we have these stories. But I have to tell you, in all fairness, there is a component of it that might have been, a hoax. I don't know. I can't prove this, but it just seemed really interesting that and as quickly as it started, it stopped. But the first guy that they actually recognized who saw it, remember Mr. Becker, nobody could find. So the next guy who sees it, he ends up getting a letter from the Frederick County Treasurer telling him that if this beast is going to be on his property, he needs to get a dog license for it. And at that point, everybody stops talking.
I know, putting on my skeptic's hat, which I can do from time to time, if you have, and we're going to assume this is a mammal in your basement for a year, and you've been feeding it, if you're a mammal, stuff goes in, stuff comes out. Yeah. Yep, and you would think that police officers, if they were examining the basement, even though if it was torn up, you'd think they would, something was here. But
yeah, no, they don't make any great detail about it, so I don't know. Now, interestingly enough, when I was looking for stuff about it in Phantoms and Monsters, there there is another sighting of it by a guy by the name of Jim in Gambrel State Park. And this is how he describes it. And this is a much more modern sighting. So we're looking in, the recent past. And he said it was a shaggy, two-legged creature the size of a deer with triangle-shaped head with pointed ears and chin, dark brown in color. And when it approached, it had made a terrible scream and backed away from me. He described it as an odd walk. As it retreated, its legs stuck out from the side of the body. So the trunk of the body and the legs are on the sides, not underneath it, making it appear almost spider-like as it moved. Now, that was about 2000. 10 years later, two men in the same mountain range reported that they saw a large animal run across the road in front of them while they were traveling down one of the dirt roads at the edge of the park, and it crossed in front of their headlights. Their description matches the general description of the Dueo, and they called it into the police because they weren't sure what they saw and if it was a predator that somebody needed to deal with or if it was somebody in a costume or what it was, but it rather unnerved them. So, but no, I agree. There's a lot of things about the story that could be real, could not be real, and there's other accounts that move up into modern time. There's another account where in mid-December, like I said, the first sighting was November, and then in mid-December there was another sighting that came to light later where a person had written it down and then had been afraid to tell anybody, and he talked about sightings for several days on his property of what he described as a large dog-like creature that would rise up on two legs and run. And years later, when the family was going through the journals, they found this particular encounter written about. He was afraid to talk because he thought people would think he was crazy. So in that instance, whatever he saw something, and it was something that convinced him that it wasn't normal, and he was afraid to talk about it. So I thought that was pretty interesting. Now, the next thing we're going to talk about is called the snallygaster. And I have to tell you, I have heard of the snallygaster for a long, long time, but it never seemed like much to me. It just kind of reminded me of a fake folklore story at the beginning. So I didn't ever pay any attention to it until recently. So the snallygaster is a kind of a reptilian bird-like creature. I'll explain what it looks like. So the first modern sighting of a snallygaster was in February 12th of 1909. And this was around Middletown, Maryland as well. And it was a large winged creature that was said to have swooped down and carried off a man walking along the road. That means it's huge if it's going to be able to pick up a person. The beast supposedly had, I'm going to describe it, dragon-like wings, long pointed tail. Sometimes there were what would look like protrusions or horns, a single eye in the middle of its forehead, and octopus-like tentacles that trailed behind like streamers, and retractable claws. Now, during this event, if you want to call it that, in 1909, the man was, as I said, people saw him be picked up and he was taken off. His body was later found with all of the blood sucked out of it.
Yuck.
Mm-hmm. And so there's a quote from a newspaper article, and it says, either the folks of Western Maryland are unusually impressionable, or there is something terrible on the loose, because within hours of the first appearance in the Register, that would be a local paper, people in Frederick and Washington counties, and even nearby in Shepherdstown, West Virginia, began reporting other encounters with the flying monster. This thing reminded me an awful lot of like the Jersey Devil.
Okay.
You know what I mean? I mean, it's not exactly the same thing, and it's larger by far, but it was that same kind of weird creature. So then we're going to move on. One of the women who reported sighting it added an additional detail in that its legs, had hooves. And a man by the name of George Jacobs said he shot the snallygaster while hunting, and he said the monster didn't care for being shot at, As a matter of fact, it was so annoyed that it pursued Jacobs across the field, all the while lunging angrily and perhaps hungrily and at the terrified man's neck as he ran. The Hagerstown Mail, a newspaper in that region, said that the Smithsonian Institute wanted to examine this creature. The Middletown Valley Register, another newspaper, reported that the military sent soldiers armed with Gatling guns. President Theodore Roosevelt said he was considering a big game hunt in Africa, but might go after an even bigger prize in the snallygaster. People were terrified. A guy by the name of Henry Witchell of Myersville shot and wounded what he thought was a snallygaster, but it turned out to be a large owl. So maybe the whole thing's an owl. I don't know. There are things called Canadian owls, which are really, really large, but they certainly don't have all the other attributes with the long tentacles and all of that. So the snallygaster continues to pursue animals and people in Middletown Valley, the South Mountain, Ketchikan Mountain, and even Cumberland area. It attacked another man, and this is the first account of it actually talking. Whatever it was, this is what this guy says. He said, "This thing came at me and it was screaming, 'My, I'm dry. I haven't had a good drink since I was killed in the Battle of Chickamauga.'" So at this point, people begin to wonder if this is not a weird manifestation of a ghost. And
that's not where my mind went, but yeah.
Well, okay, maybe they. Okay, you're thinking maybe.
I'm thinking demonic. Yeah.
Okay, yeah. And in Sharpsburg, Maryland, there was a report of a nest of eggs of some creature that was found. In Emmitsburg, Maryland, the creature tried to grab a guy by the name of Ed Brown, a worker on the Emmitsburg Railroad. The beast caught him, but Brown was lucky that his suspenders broke and he got away. A mob pursued the snallygaster when it displayed a new skill, shooting fire out of its nostrils. Now, there's no sightings for 23 years. Everything's gone away. It's just a distant memory at this point, probably told by old people to their grandkids to spook them at night. But in November of 1932, reports of the snallygaster begin again, and they're receiving national attention again. This time, there weren't reports of attacks, but people were still scared. In December 21st, in Hagerstown Morning Herald, the headline ran, "Death of the snallygaster is reported. Accounts differ." The newspaper then proceeds to state that the body of a snallygaster was found in a 2,500-gallon vat of moonshine hidden in the mountains. Now, okay, sounds crazy. Everybody's got to be smiling, except for this interesting little thing.
Mm-hmm.
They interview a guy who is a revenue agent for the government in Washington County, and he claims that he raided a still around the same time as when this event supposedly occurred, and that he found the monster, not bootleggers. The bootleggers had fled and left the vat and stuff there. Obviously, you couldn't pick it up and take it. And when they broke open the vat, I don't know if anybody knows this or not, but in the 1920s and 30s, when the Prohibition, all this was going on, they would break the vats open or blow them up with dynamite and just like blow the whole thing up so that the people couldn't use the materials to rebuild the still. So this is what they do. So they smack it open, and this guy's name is George Danforth, the revenue agent, and he's quoted in the newspaper article. He said, "Imagine our feelings when our eyes feasted on the monster submerged in a vat of liquid." And he said, apparently the lion, the mash, had started to eat away some of its flesh. The remains of the snallygaster were lost to science when Danforth and the other revenuers carried out their prohibition duties and ordered the vat and contents blown up by a charge of dynamite. The Cumberland Vat Evening Times reported a few years after the Snallygaster's death, another Snallygaster was reportedly seen in Middletown Valley. This one was very small, though. There are those who believe that the young monster is a small Snallygaster, and they claim that it was from the unusual heat of this past summer that one of the eggs must have hatched. And he says that the article says they also noted that they talked to scientists and they referenced back to like dinosaur eggs and stuff like this. And they said it could be that it would take years for a Snallygaster egg to hatch. The last sighting known and reported that I could find was in 1949. It's an interesting story.
Yeah, I just quickly took a look at a picture or a depiction of what one looks like, and yeah, it's pretty bizarre.
It is like I said, it doesn't look like the Jersey Devil at all, but it's along the same lines. It comes, it goes, it's mysterious, and it does bizarre things, over the course of time. And like with the Jersey Devil, we've got sightings all the way into like a few years ago. And it'll drop off for 20, 30, 40 years. Nobody will talk about it. And then bam, a bunch of sightings, and all of them in a couple nights. And interestingly enough, in some of the modern sightings, there was a police officer, I believe it was a police chief, who was one of the very first people to claim they saw it in one of the most modern sightings. And the dude had nothing to gain by it. Like he was, it wasn't like it was going to build his reputation or anything. People were probably not real thrilled with the fact that the guy started this set of sightings, but he claimed he saw it when he was patrolling and that it was on a rooftop. So as weird as it sounds, maybe there is something out there. Maybe there's not. I don't know. But I just found it interesting that so many of these cultures within the Native American community had these beings, and now we're finding that the whites had them, and then they've just kind of transmitted over. And interestingly enough, they stay in the same area. It's not like they move very far. They seem to be centered in a certain spot, and they stay there. It's almost like a habitat. I don't know what they are, but I thought they were interesting. The next one is called a pity pat. So
cute name.
It is.
But I bet it's not going to be cute. Yeah.
It's not going to be cute. So this one, this story goes like this. There's it's called Pity Pat Hollow now, but it's because of this story. And prior to that, it had a different name. It was called Plank Road or Fairy Town Road, depending on where you want to, how you want to talk about it. So basically, in the 1860s, right at the end of the American Civil War, there was a young couple in a horse and carriage going along this little narrow twisty track, and for some reason the horse spooked and took off up this hollow. And as it was going along, it lost its head and it just went wild, and it smashed the carriage over on its side, and it broke off from the horse. And inside, of course, was the man, his wife, and the little one. And the little one was never found. So they said that whatever the creature was that came flying out and spooked the horse, because something came flying out and spooked the horse. They couldn't tell what it was. It was dark. They just saw a mass of something. Took the baby with them. And that was basically it. So you can understand it's a ghost story at the beginning. It sounds like it's a story of something that it could be a haunting. Is the sound of something shuffling along the road is what is haunting it. So after that, people just kind of shun the area, and they say, oh, you can hear the baby walking along the road and all of this because you could hear the sound of something shuffling along in the dirt. But in 1890s, a steamboat captain by the name of Samuel Elsey was in the process of going home to his area where he lived up that hollow when a shadowy creature got after him, and it was the same area where the baby had disappeared. And so Samuel, he's riding his horse, and he's heading home. It's late at night. He just wants to get there and crash. And all of a sudden, whatever this thing is spooks his horse. Horse takes off. He can see this thing following him. He can hear it crashing. It's not doing the little pitty pat sound. It's crashing along, whatever it is. The story is that he literally rode the horse almost to death, got to the first house he could find, jumped off the horse, and ran into the house, and without it being announced, slammed the door and told them what was going on, and he refused to leave the house until morning. He was terrified. So over the years, it kind of gets forgotten, and then eventually there's another one of those sightings, and it goes on and on like this for a long time. Down this hollow, today there's photographs of it. It's on a place called Old Mill Dam Bridge in this hollow. And the hollow, by the way, also has the name of Shipley Hollow today. So there's two different names for it. A lot of stuff in Maryland and Virginia has like two different names. It's interesting to me. But anyway, and people still go out there. They still sit there and wait for it in the dark and hear this thing shuffling by. Some of them say they see something. Some of them say they just hear the shuffling. But it's something that's gone on forever. And the interesting thing about this is, tying it into Native American things, is that this hollow had been known to be occupied by an animal that the Native people had told the local white settlers not to settle in that area, that this thing would never rest. And over the course of time, these stories began to develop out of it. And they didn't talk about what it was. They just said that there was this creature there that no one could see, but you could hear it walk. And I just thought that was interesting. Now, I have to tell you, I found a bunch of ghost stories, other stories, hunters that claim to have seen something moving very fast that dipped and moved around them, things like that. But it was just really interesting to hear the stories. Now, I'm not going to touch on the Mothman, although there are Native American legends of a creature very much like the Mothman, but he's been done to death, so I'm going to kind of skip over him just because there's been so many stories of him. Now, there's another creature, and we're going to get into something really, I think, more realistic. So this is the Appalachian Black Panther. We all live, you and I both live in the Appalachian Mountains to some extent. This is the Allegheny Plateau of the Appalachian Mountains. And since the beginning of the written history, the Native people talked about a black cougar. We called it a Black Panther. Now, according to historians and biologists and all of that, there is no such creature, never has been, never will be. No, it's not that. They've tried. It's jaguars, it's leopards, it's bobcats, and it's melanin fluctuates, and so that's what it is. However, I would like to say that there have been some very credible sightings in this area of large black cats. The best ones were in Heinemann, circa 82, 84, something like that. Right at the end of the school year. I've talked about this before, so I won't belabor it too much, but if this is your first podcast, I want to give you the flavor of it. So it was right at the last week of school, so late May going into June, and the last week of school for all the kids is, they're restless. They just want to get done and go home and get to play and hang out for the summer. And this teacher had a group of kids outside. They were first graders, I believe, and the two teachers are standing right inside the door watching the kids, and the kids are playing on the playground. Now, this is a very, very rural area, and it is not uncommon at all for the children's playgrounds to be circled by woods on three sides. And that's exactly what it was like in Hyman. There was this huge swath of woods at the far end of the playground. And the teacher sees this one little boy walking off away from the other kids. For whatever the reason, I don't know. And all of a sudden, out of the woods comes running what she described as a black panther. And it was headed toward this boy as if to cut him off from the rest of the children and get between him and them and break him away. The teacher goes running out the door screaming. It kind of startles the cat. The cat pauses. The little boy turns around and runs back into the group of kids, and the cat takes off for the woods. Both teachers would later agree they saw this cat. And that was, that obviously made the local news. It was the local gossip in town. People were terrified. Oh my gosh, there's a Black Panther in this area. And we all don't question it because there have been that many sightings over the course of history. And about 4 or 5 days go by. We're now in the last couple days of school. One day there's a kid in about 3rd or 4th grade. He's sitting there looking out the window. Nothing strange about that. We're literally at the last couple days. And, by then most of the kids just want the teachers to shut up and let him go outside and play. And he's looking out the window and the teacher's just talking, and he's looking out the window and the teacher's just talking. Again, Hyman school, grade school. And finally the teacher says to him, "Would you like to tell us what's so exciting outside?" And he says, without missing a beat, "The big cat walking across the playground." She and all the kids turned their heads to the window, and sure enough, walking across the playground was this large black cat. They're talking the size of a large dog. It was huge. It was not a leopard. It did not have spots. It was a solid black cat, not a bobcat. The fur wasn't right, the color, the size, nothing. Anybody's ever seen a bobcat, they've got tufted ears and they're kind of grays and browns and golds. This was not that animal, whatever it was. And then school went out and people stopped talking about it. But on the mountain 7 miles from where I live, there have been black cat sightings. 7, 8, 9, 10, 12 miles from where I live in the opposite direction, there have been black cat sightings. There have been black cat sightings over in the Williamsburg area. There have been black cat sightings all over this region for generations. I don't know what people are seeing. However, somebody's seeing something. And I would like to add that there's no mountain lions supposedly in Pennsylvania either. And I did a book.
Supposedly, yes.
Supposedly. And I interviewed a guy from the Fish and Game Commission who, would go be the guy to check on that. He was a zoologist, and he would go and check on stuff like this. And I know of 2 sightings of these mountain lions that make no sense. Now, his argument to me is that, yep, there are stray mountain lions. They are found from time to time. I think in Lancaster, Reading, a few years ago, they found one. But the cat had a number tattooed in its ear. And so it was obviously a pet sold, and somebody turned it out when they couldn't afford to feed it, or they got tired of it, or it got dangerous or something. And eventually it went back into humanity, into this little town, looking for food or to try to socialize because it was used to socializing with humans, and they caught it. And his argument is all the panthers all the cougars you see in Pennsylvania, that's all they are. They're just, animals that were turned loose. Not arguing that that's probably true, that the vast majority of them are. However, I know of a farm in the Bedford Everett area, which is 20 some miles from me, and the guy there had a horse that was run down and killed. He shot the cat that killed it, and he said it was a cougar, a mountain lion. And he called the Fish and Game Commission, and the next day the word got to me, and I contacted him, and he's like, "Honey, I wish you would have called me a few hours ago. The Fish and Game guy came and got it. I got his card. I got his name. You can call him and see if he'll let you take a look." And drat for the fact that farmers don't tend to take, they're not looking for publicity, so they don't take photographs of crap. Because when I called the guy, like literally an hour or 2 later, the guy said, "Oh yeah, the horse died." And I'm like, "So you took the horse and the cat?" He's like, "Oh no, there was no cat. The horse died." And I said, "What did the horse die of?" And he's like, "Oh, a bear attack." Pretty sure the dude knew the difference between a bear and a mountain lion when he shot it, Another sighting, and this one I cannot discount, was my mom. In one of my books on Pennsylvania, I tell this story. And my mother was at my aunt's house outside of Williamsburg, and she lived on a farm, and my aunt was upstairs doing something, and my mom was down there. They were getting ready to make supper, so they had this big pot of water cooking because they were going to make spaghetti or something like that. And my uncle's hunting dog was tied outside. Hunting dogs are a different breed of animal. Anybody who's grown up around hunting dogs knows that they're treated very well, but they're not pets. So they have their own kennels, and they come out and they're trained, and people put a lot of time into those dogs, so they're worth a lot of money. And all of a sudden, this dog is just screaming, and my mom goes out on the back porch. She takes a look, and there's this big tawny mountain lion, and it's circling this dog who's tied to a chain and can't go too far, and it's circling this dog and growling. And my mom doesn't know what to do. She can't just let it tear the dog apart. And the only thing she could think of is she reached out, grabbed 2 hot pads, grabbed that pot of hot water, and took off running. And she's screaming as she's running. And the cat looks up and she throws the water at the cat. And some of it must hit the cat because the cat screamed and then took off for the woods. My mom turned around and ran back for the house, called her sister from upstairs and said, "You need to get a hold of your husband. The cat hurt him. The dog's injured." And the dog was injured and the dog was okay. It was saved. But I can't argue with that. Like, we're not talking strangers and stories from a long ago and far away. We're talking 3 very rattled people and a dog I saw that had wounds on its neck. I can't explain that. I just thought it was interesting. And to not be outdone, there are, and maybe these are the same stories and the same beast, I don't know, but there are also werewolf stories also coming from the Virginia area. So, Maryland, Virginia, West Virginia, Southern Pennsylvania, this region has a lot of this stuff. This came in 2011, so not a long time ago, Woodbridge, Virginia. A werewolf was seen, according to the Prince William County Police spokesman, Jonathan Percoit, who told northernvirginia.com in an interview, the witnesses saw a creature that lurked in the woods near a shopping center after 10 p.m. Police were dispatched to the area. No trace of this creature could be found. But in Henrico County, Virginia, near a place called the Confederate Hills Recreation Center, there were a lot of werewolf sightings not too far away. In fact, several police reports were made, and other people also claimed to have seen a dog-like creature, 6 foot tall, covered in gray fur, and it was on 4 legs, but would often stand up on 2 legs and then basically belt off into the woods. There are no records of anything dying in that area. It has been known to chase people. There are howls reported as though there's a large canid, and obviously it could be something else howling. I'm not going to even try to say it's not. But there's also a place in Virginia called the Great Dismal Swamp, where an 8-year-old boy reported that his home was there in that area, the Great Dismal Swamp area. And he was in bed at night in his house, and he said he rolled over and he looked out his window and came face to face with a dog-faced monster on 2 legs. He freaked out, started screaming, and he said it was on its hind legs looking in the window, and it had a human-like face except for the nose, which was a snout like a dog. The beast stared at him with yellow eyes, and the boy shot out of bed and screamed and cried and got his mom and dad's attention, and then refused to go back into the room. He thought it was going to come through the window and get him. So it's an interesting set of tales. I thought it was really fascinating. So this is going to bring me to my last story for this evening, and then we're going to visit some other things in the next couple weeks. And if you're interested in the Appalachian Mountain, believe me, I haven't even begun to scratch the surface. I haven't talked to you about the cursed families and the families that had strange goings on, or the fact that there's things inside the mountain that are older than time that seem to possess people. I haven't talked about 1,000 different things, the mines that are in these mountains and the tunnels and the cave systems and all of this that are known to have creatures in them. And we can save them for another day if you want, or if you want to hear more, let me know. But this is the story that kind of started this particular episode. So when I was a kid growing up, I was in 4th grade, and our art teacher, the last week of school, decided that instead of starting art projects, he was just going to tell spooky tales. And so during the last art class of the summer, before the summer, he shut the blinds in the room and turned off all the lights and just kind of did a Halloweeny kind of thing about telling stories. And of the stories he told a couple white lady stories and other things, but he told me something about a taily-poo. And I thought he made it up. My whole life I've thought that until just recently. Going through the Appalachian mountain stuff, I found this creature called a taily-poo. And the taily-poo, what apparently is something that the Native American people talked about and that both Native Americans and settlers encountered. So I'll give you the story the way I heard it, and then I will tell you very quickly one of the variations on it, the original variation on it. So the story as I heard it is that there was a man who was hungry, and this would have been around the turn of the 20th century, late 1800s, early 1900s, and it had been a really sparse season. When there's a drought, the animals go away. They look for water elsewhere. So there wasn't a whole lot of grain and produce grown that summer. And the animals were gone, and the water was out of the creeks, so the fish were gone. So it was hard to find food. Everybody was hungry. And this guy was hungry. He was an old fellow, lived by himself, and he would put out his traps in the morning. And a lot of folks trapped because you could sell the hides for money. And when he's checking his traps, he came across this one trap, and all that was in it was what looked like a tail of an animal, a dog's tail, something. It wasn't much, and it certainly wasn't going to be enough to sell or make any money from. But it was food. So he decided to skin it and use it and cook whatever this was. So he did exactly that, and he ate it and went upstairs to his room, shut his door, and went to sleep in this little house he lived in. And as he fell asleep, he heard something scratching at the northern corner of the little house, and it was just this faint scratching, and he was like, "What is that? Are there mice in the wall?" And didn't pay it any attention at first, but he woke up a little bit later, and the scratching was a lot louder. And he realized that whatever it was literally tearing through the wall. And he didn't know whether he should get up or what he should do. And the gun was downstairs hanging over the front door. So he wasn't sure it was a good idea to go down there to get it, because whatever it is sounded like it was like literally tearing through into the house. So he's laying there in bed, and with his ears, he's following the progress, and he hears the splintering of the wood, and he hears furniture falling over. He knows it's downstairs now, and he runs over and makes sure the door is locked, and it is locked. And he's like, okay, so I'll pull the dresser up in front of it. And he pulls the dresser up in front of it, jumps back into bed, and he's sitting there waiting. And he hears this thing cluttering around downstairs, and then the voice, and it's calling loudly, "Taily-poo, taily-poo, I want my taily-poo." And he's like, "Holy crap, what is that?" And the thing starts climbing up the steps. He can hear it. Its nails clattering on the steps, and the voice getting louder and louder. And it gets to the door, and he's like, okay. It has not escaped him that it dug through the wall. He's hoping that the dresser will slow it down or something. He doesn't know what to do with it. And it's just wailing that Taily-po. I want my taily-po thing. And it's digging at the door, and he can hear the door rattling as it's hitting it. It's hitting it with great force. And it digs a hole through, and then it pushes so hard it knocks over the little chest of drawers he had drug in front of it. He pulls the blanket up, hoping that it won't notice he's there, and he feels it hit the bed and then leap on top of the bed. And it digs its claws in, and that's the last he knows. The whole time he hears this wailing voice screaming that it wants its taily-po. They say that when they found him, his gut was ripped open. The bits of his dinner, his last meal, still in there. The beast, they say, wanders still the mountains to this day. I don't know if it's a ghost or what it is, but it's still looking for its taily-po. Now, that is the version I heard. There are multiple versions out there today because it's become a folk tale. However, the original story is very much the same, except that the fella had 3 dogs with him, and it killed the dogs as well. And it is just a story that I thought was folklore. Like, I honestly thought it was an urban legend kind of story because the guy yelled boo at the end of it, and we all jumped. We're, 4th grade, 10 years old, and giggled and laughed, and I never thought any more of it than that. I've told the story through the years as to my kids, for fun. Never told it in a serious setting where I was doing a speaking engagement or anything, because it just never seemed to me that it was real. Maybe it's not real. But then again, there's an awful lot going on in this world that we don't understand. I think that there's an answer to a lot of these monsters, and I think that answer lies very far back in time. I've touched on it slightly, and I'm going to touch on it one last time as we end. If you believe the biblical books, not just the Bible, but also like the first book of Enoch and stuff like that, and the book of Jasher, there were beings that were created that are called Nephilim. And the Nephilim were from a relation between an angel and a human. There's a lot of detail to all of this, and I'm going to spare you that tonight, although it's fascinating when you really understand it. And these creatures were half human and half angelic, and they bred with not just humans, but with other animals, because they weren't tied to the rules of humanity. And there have long been stories of these Nephilim creatures, shapeshifters, seekers of blood, things that ate humans. What if those things actually did happen? What if the first book of Enoch was telling us the truth, and the book of Jasher? Those books were in all the old Jewish homes at the time of Christ. Christ would reference them in the Bible. In the Old Testament, there's references to them. What if? What if the things we see, what if the things that we hear about are out there, moving from dimension to dimension? Maybe that's why we can't catch a Bigfoot. Maybe that's why the werewolf suddenly disappears. What if? And before you think that it's maybe foolhardy or wishful thinking, we know there's dimensions out there. CERN talks about them. Scientists talk about them. Today we're learning that a lot of the stuff we thought were science fiction isn't. In serious religious circles today, and in serious cryptid circles today, they're talking about the idea of interbreeding species and Nephilim that could shapeshift. What if? As a storyteller, as a folklorist, as a person who loves history, you can never discount the what if. And this one, it's a story thousands of years old if it's true. What if it's not 100 different things, but one thing that's followed down through history? What if? And with that, I'm going to say good night.